The second last book of the New Testament is the letter of Jude. Jude is considered by one commentator to be the least preached about book in the New Testament. It's only short, it's about 25 verses or so, and that's the entire book. Jude is actually an abbreviated name for Judas or Judah. And so there's a little bit of mystery as to who this is, but it's probably resolved by the text itself. He describes himself in the opening verse as a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. This identifies him with the same character known as Jude, recorded in Matthew chapter 13, verse 55, and Mark chapter 6 and verse 3, and also alluded to in Acts chapter 1 and verse 14. He was, by this information, the son of Mary and the younger brother of Jesus Christ, as far as giving birth from Mary as well. So here we have this man who we are told from the Gospel of John initially did not believe the claims of his brother, Jesus. He was someone who came to believe when he experienced the resurrection. And as a result of that, he became a leader in the first century church. He would have written this letter around about 60 AD. His brother, James, was martyred a couple of years after this. And as a result of this, we see that Jude became someone known to the apostles. He's recorded as being in that upper room in Acts chapter 1 and verse 14. And arguably, as I mentioned about the Epistle of Second Peter, which bears a great deal of similarities to the Epistle of Jude, he was someone who was very proficient in the understanding of how the Greek rhetoricians, that is the Greek speakers, used persuasive language. In fact, he makes a comment here in verse 16 about how many of the false teachers were highly trained in Greek rhetoric, and he calls them loud-mouthed. And so Jude also is unusual because he quotes from what we call a pseudepigraphal, that's a silent P in front of that, pseudepigraphal book, First Enoch, which up until about the 2nd century BC was passed down orally. And we know that Jude was aware of the oral tradition because he quotes the oral tradition from 1 Enoch chapter 1 and verse 9, where he says in his verse 14, it was about these that Enoch, the seventh from Adam. And if you count the genealogies recorded in Genesis, you see that indeed Enoch was the seventh descendant from Adam. And so he's quoting this book not because that book was necessarily divinely inspired, like we now realize his is, but to add a bit of weight to what he's saying. He also makes reference to the teachings of the apostles. We know he interacted with Peter. He was probably the secretary of Peter's second epistle because the language is so similar. So here we have Jude, who also, I would encourage pastors whenever they finish their service, or whoever's leading the service in a church, to consider his final two verses, which is what we would refer to as a benediction. Good words to leave with people. This is all about the epistle from Jude.